Pricing is one of the easiest levers for growth. If you imagine how hard it is to go and win another 10% new customers, so that means all of the demand gen, the op creation, the sales work, the enablement, the solutions work to go and win that extra 10% of customers, or just putting up your prices by 10%. One of those feels a lot easier than the other one to me.
It's our jobs to tell better stories. And always remember, it's the risk takers that are rewarded.
People are sick and tired of being marketed to, and they're sick and tired of being sold. The single biggest story today in sales and marketing is how our customers are buying differently.
Hello, Andrew, and thank you so much coming to our podcast as a guest.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate.
So I hate to start a conversation like this on a negative note, but there's no hiding from the fact that world economy is going through a pretty rough patch at the moment, and it's been going through that for a while now. So it's no news there. And obviously, SaaS companies are also starting to feel seriously impacted by that. Like we all know what's been happening with the workforce, Salesforce laying off people. Not the only company, obviously. Quite a lot of tech companies doing that as well. So I know, because I've been following you guys, I know you did at Paddle recently a research into the kind of state of SaaS companies in general. And I was wondering if you could share some findings with us from that. What does growth in SaaS companies look like at the moment in a situation like this?
Sure. And to give some credence to some of these opinions, I think let's start with the data we're looking at. So Paddle of about 3,000 software companies that use our billing system. So we obviously have visibility into their finances. And then we recently acquired Profitwell, who see the revenue of almost 30,000 subscription businesses, mostly software. So we're tracking about 28 billion of ARR. So we've got a really good view on the marketplace. And we can drop a link in the show notes to a fuller tweet thread on this from Patrick Campbell from Profitwell. But across consumer and B2B, yes, it's not looking great. You've led with some of the numbers we see in terms of layoffs. And I think we probably haven't seen the end of those yet. But when we see our data, we see that a few other things are happening. Cancellations are increasing, and we've been seeing this, in a few spikes ever since kind of the start of the year, actually, when the Ukrainian war started happening, when Russia invaded Ukraine, and the economic implications of that. Really, we saw consumer leading the charge here as people started cleansing out a bunch of their different subscriptions that they perhaps didn't think they needed anymore. And we've also now seen it in B2B as well. And we've also seen new sales slowing as well. So there's been a few kind of ups and downs across the course of the year, but it's not looking like a good couple of years ahead. And of course, there are outliers here. There are companies that are continuing to grow really fast, but many are facing significant challenges in new revenue, those two things I mentioned, cancellations and new sales, but also with a lack of fundraising options. And so that means there are difficult years ahead as people perhaps run out of capital they've raised, because there's a very clear bifurcation when it comes to raising capital. Either you need to grow really fast and aggressively and efficiently, or you have to run for break even. And let's be clear, there are a lot of businesses in the marketplace, lots of SaaS businesses that are stuck in this messy middle. They have growth rates that just aren't fast enough to prove breakout growth, 70, 80, 90, 100, 200% growth, but they also don't have a clear path to break even. So that's a really challenging situation to be in.
It's growing fast and efficiently and scalably is difficult at best of times, let alone in a situation that we are in right now. So that's tough.
Yeah. So Andrew, what do you think that are currently the biggest barriers of growth if you think about SaaS businesses?
Yeah, so I think there's the normal barriers, the kind of trigger points you see in a SaaS business. So that would be finding product market fit until you actually don't know that what you have built fits a market need. There's no point pouring fuel onto that fire. And then there's kind of the process of go-to-market fit. Once you've got something that's matching a market need, can you find a repeatable and scalable process of bringing that to market? And then you've got all the questions of efficiency and how you kind of open up new market segments as you scale. from your probably very tight ideal customer to new ideal customers over time. We've just mentioned access to capital, I think, is a big barrier to growth right now, particularly businesses that their operations were built on the premise of free and easy access to capital, and now that's no longer true. If you've been built in a much more bootstrapped or efficient way, then actually it affects you much less. And then really there's the challenge of balancing acquisition, monetization, and expansion as you scale. So all of those things are things that are on the kind of in the boardrooms of the SaaS businesses that we know. And all of those present barriers to growth if they're not dealt with well.
Those things sound like barriers for growth that are always there, not only in the situation that we currently are in. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, we're in a situation that is marked by probable economic recession for multiple quarters, but it's also marked by severe uncertainty. We've come out of COVID. We've got still a backdrop of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We've got pretty significant political instability in the US and in the UK, and uncertainty creates lots of challenges and opportunities. So, if you've built a business on the basis of access to loads of capital, that's the problem. If you've got a value prop that relies on a growth-focused buyer or lots of disposable income, that's a challenge. If you're starting to build a new business on current fundamentals, when you can build strong with no sunk costs, then that's a real opportunity right now. If you're able to pivot fast, perhaps to a value prop that is around cost reduction, then you've got good opportunities. So there's a whole bunch of challenges and opportunities based on this situation right now. And it's about making sure you can find yourself on the right side of that argument.
Well, I suppose that's the $1 million question, how you can get to that right side, right? And in relation to that, actually, since a lot of our listeners are marketers, so how can marketing help in a situation like this?
So I've just mentioned a few factors that are based on the current circumstance. So let's break those down. Messaging. Is your current value proposition aligned with the real market need? Runway extension, cost reduction, flexibility in your operational costs. All of those are clearly going to resonate much more. And so if you have a clear value prop that's around that, fantastic. If you don't, working with your product team to understand, is there new product features or releases that could help that? Or is there just a way of messaging this differently where you're serving perhaps a different buyer or a different function or for a different reason? So messaging is one. Efficiency we spoke about. So yeah, it's important that you understand your customer acquisition cost and you're sitting within that envelope. You're understanding the economics of the business, the unit economics of your business, the capital you've got, the runway you've got to sit within, so that you're becoming more efficient in your marketing. Thirdly, I think it's really interesting that there's lots of businesses now that are rediscovering their customers because perhaps they're finding new customer acquisition really hard. And so they're putting more resource on growing their existing customer base. We can come back to that in a bit if that's interesting. And then finally, I do think it's really interesting right now that some of the smartest marketers I know, and it's certainly something that many of my team are looking at as we look into 2023, that we're planning for how we grow an audience rather than just focusing on demand gen. If we're in a world where less customers are wanting to buy the services that you're offering, then should you also be thinking about how you amass the community, how you build the content-driven audience so that you can accelerate new customer acquisition when the wind does turn in your favor later. Mm-hmm. So there's just a few different elements we can think about. Sorry,
just before we move on, I got stuck with that last bit there about audience. Does that mean community-led growth, or are you talking about a different thing?
I'm not sure I can even define community-led growth. I think when I think about community, I think about a few things. I think, I feel it's just an audience. If it's one person or one brand talking to a base, it's a community when there's also some peer content or peer interactions. And secondly, there needs to be some understanding of what membership means. Now, it doesn't have to be in a formal sense, but people are gathering around something. And so there's some basic delineation of whether you're interested in this thing or whether you find yourself in this group. And then that usually is defined by a location, whether physical or virtual, a Slack group or whatever format you're choosing to meet in. So those are three kind of elements of community. But I don't think it's just about community. I think there's people who are not actually looking at community by that definition, but they're investing in newsletter growth. They're investing in, content production or acquisition. They're investing in building out creative to attract their target market. So yeah, I think it's content, it's community, it's really thinking about how can we start engaging with the audience that will become our buyers in a few years' time when the markets do turn.
Fair.
Right. So you mentioned these different elements, you got messaging, efficiency, customers, and audience. How would you actually would you single something out, or kind of what would be the best part, like, to start with? Would you kind of prioritize something?
Yeah, I think that really depends on the business. I think certainly if you've got a big pool of customers and you've got some levers for growth, that'll be the first place I go to. How can we make sure we hit our revenue targets off existing customers alone? Is there a model where we should be taking, demand resource, campaign resource, demand dollars, and moving that towards our existing customers? And we can talk about a few examples of that if that's helpful. I think, in terms of those other ones, the messaging one, I think, is just a really obvious one that most marketers would have already started to do. We do see a few tone deaf marketers right now who are continuing to preach this kind of growth at all costs value prop, but most people have dialed that back. So yeah, customers I think is really interesting, and then the efficiency thing I think is obviously vital for any marketer to be considering. What is your customer acquisition cost? What is your cost envelope? What is your are you operating on that rule of 40? What's the benchmarks of other companies who are operating at your current stage, and are you becoming more efficient than them?
So, do you actually have any kind of go-to frameworks to deal with all the challenges and the bits and bobs you just mentioned?
Probably not something that sits across all of them. If we, I think when it comes to efficiency, there's actually just recently been a ton of the autumn or fall type reports have just dropped from OpenView, and I think from Bessemer and a few others. KeyBank have dropped theirs as well, where they're breaking down benchmarks of their SaaS companies that they're surveying. And so on the efficiency side, I think it's in everyone's interest, if you're in a marketing function or leading a marketing function, to go and look at what those benchmarks are, so you can have an informed conversation internally. You can understand whether you're doing well from a more kind of best practice or benchmark perspective. So that's definitely something that's really necessary. On the customer side, there's 4 things I think about as a framework. It's how do we engage, how do we retain, how do we grow, and how do we refer? And so thinking about how our programs, our communications, our resources are set up to help our customers engage with us and each other more. So that's learning, that's making sure they have a positive experience with every touch point. Retain, how are we making sure they're not churning? Growing, how do we make sure that they are growing themselves, and therefore hopefully as part of that they're buying more services or products from us? And then finally that referral piece, how are they becoming our best advocates in a market where perhaps some other demand channels are drying up? So that's a couple of things I think about. And when it comes to the audience side of things, there's a few places I look in terms of frameworks for this. I think Audience Plus and Anthony's work there have got some great frameworks around it. And Patrick Campbell from Profit World, part of our business, they've about a year or 2 ago released their playbook for audience growth and their media strategy. So we can drop that in the show notes if that's a helpful framework for anyone.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning those. We'll definitely include that. We are, as marketers, we are always looking for new frameworks that we can use and utilize. And actually, on that note, I kind of want to maybe even step back a little bit and go back to those barriers of growth that we started this conversation with. And the first one that you mentioned there was the product market fit. And that's we work with clients, and we obviously try to find that. And then even if we found it, then, there might be a new market where we have to figure that out again. And it's a common, I don't want to call it a challenge because it's just part of what we do. So, but I do want to ask you about any advice you have to share with our listeners who maybe are in that situation where are trying to figure out the product market fit.
I think there's some great frameworks already in play that you and your listeners probably would have come across. I think just to add on to some of those things that I found practically useful in my journey of finding product fit in a few different businesses. Firstly, think about not just testing against the product feature, but also the overall value prop and then the target customer. There isn't one test. Oh, do we have product market fit? You've got to think about the actual product itself, the value prop of how you're describing it and what impact it's having, and the target customer. And I think too often we think about it as a static equation, because we're actually not testing with different types of customer, or testing different types of value prop, or different ways of our product delivering that value. So I think it's important to think through those three elements. I think secondly, and perhaps building on that, for Sales Impact Academy, for several years, I've taught their account-based marketing course. And I find it fascinating that I've tracked over the courses we've done there, and it's probably been 5 or 6 cohorts. Increasingly, one of the questions I ask is, how are you using ABM in your business? Is this, you've got a purist ABM approach where everything you do is ABM? Is it adding on a new approach within your existing demand gen or inbound? Or are you using it to test and learn about new markets? And I've seen a real big uptick in people using account-based marketing strategy, account-based marketing methodology as part of their product market fit experimentation.
Really?
So perhaps if you've got a horizontal play, but you could sell it into all of these different places, then using ABM programs to find out which of those different ICPs is going to respond best to those campaigns. And is that a leading indicator of a market that you should be focusing on? So that's the second thing that I think is interesting. And then finally, it's a truism, it's obvious, but please, please, please don't spend to scale until you've got the confidence that you're at that point of product market fit. So those are just a few of my top of head thoughts on it.
Okay, so how do you know you have the confidence in product market fit?
I use the word confidence specifically because I often think, in a rational scenario with low egos where everyone is able to challenge each other and have good quality conversations and learn from customers and have a growth mindset and all of those things, I believe that confidence is a leading indicator for many, many things. It's a leading indicator for finding product market fit. If you are having customer conversations where you are able to take that insight and refine your product, your value prop, or change your target customer, then confidence that you are making progress should precede the sense of perhaps a more academic definition of product market fit, which some people define as, if you take this product away from people, will they be up in arms and come running to your door, or will they not really care? Or will a conversion rate increase, and if you have 10 opportunities, will you be able to close 8 of them? There's those more academic definitions or more metrics driven definitions of PMF, but I do think confidence is a leading indicator. Do you have confidence that this market you're selling into is now ready to buy, is making use of this? And that often precedes some of those metrics we see within the funnel.
So would it be too simplistic to say that if you're unsure, then you don't have product market fit?
Yeah.
I think some degree of questioning is necessary at every stage. When you've got complete certainty, it means you've probably got something wrong. But yes, I do think that when you're in that phase of constantly questioning yourself, again, it relies on you being in a team where you're able to challenge each other, where you do have customer insight, when you're having honest conversations. Because if those things aren't true, then you can have a huge amount of misplaced confidence, which is again a danger.
Fair enough. How about the next step? So let's say you found your product market fit, and then what? How do you get going with your good fit user acquisition process?
It's important to recognize that there are many different ways to go to market, and these are getting better described over the last couple of years. There's an inbound process, there's an outbound process, there's a partner-led go-to-market motion, there's a product-led go-to-market motion. And so I think the first step is to actually read up on all of those different approaches. So often I speak to founders who are just choosing one of those by default. They've hired their first sales team, their first salesperson by default, or they're operating an inbound model by default. And it's not because they've chosen that, it was just the only thing they knew or the only thing they'd experienced. So recognize that there are these different go-to-market models. And Sangram over at, I think it's GTM Partners, is doing some good research into kind of the modern go-to-market motions. So recognize that there's these different processes, test and learn which ones might work best for you. Look at all the data and best practice across all of those different types of go-to-market motion, and certain ones of them work much better in different circumstances, different price points, selling into different type of businesses in different types of economic climates. And then you've got to define your own version. It's not that there's a cookie cutter type of 4 or 5 options and you just choose one. It's a case of defining what works for you as a business based on how much capital you have available, how fast you have to grow based on the requirements of raising that capital, based on what is the ACV, the cost of the service you're selling, the type of customers you're selling into. All of those will have a play in it. So yeah, I'd absolutely start off with doing some reading around those different motions so you have something to choose from.
Excellent.
All right. Can we go to some positive things now?
I thought we'd be doing that.
Can we just talk about something as some barriers for growth? So on the other side of the coin, so levers for growth. So what do you see as the biggest growth levers for SaaS businesses in long-term view?
So the first way I think about this is the 3 biggest levers: acquisition, monetization, and expansion. Everything we do in a SaaS business boils down to one of those 3. So if we just think about those in a bit more depth, we've got the acquisition piece, so new customer acquisition. I'm sure we'll come on to some of the buzz around freemium or self-serve later, but when it comes to acquisition, yes, there's these different go-to-market motions. There's whether we acquire these customers under a free plan, it's whether it's self-serve, whether they have to deal with a sales team, whether we're doing it in one territory, whether we're doing it in many territories. One of our key specialties is in internationalization, winning emerging markets, winning international markets. And so there's a whole bunch you can dig into in acquisition. Also going to different customer sizes, segments. Perhaps we've been serving mid-market. Is there a play to go and acquire a different segment, up-market or down-market? Then when it comes to monetization, this is a lot around pricing and packaging. So not just the technicalities of pricing and how we describe it, but also what that means for our economic model. Do we offer multi-year discounts? Are we trying to get people to pay, for longer periods of time? Is it usage-based? Is it, based on a feature, or is it based on some value metric? So there's a whole bunch you could dig into on monetization, and that's a lever that's often underlooked. And then we've all overlooked, and then we've also got expansion. So are we reducing churn? And are we increasing the ability for our customers to spend more money with us? Are there multiple vectors of expansion revenue where our best customers, they can buy more seats, or they can buy new features, or they can buy more data, or they have some form of usage-based pricing where they just grow and we grow as a result? So those are the 3 things I'd kind of hang all of the different strategies on.
So, okay, there's quite a lot that we can continue discussing there. And but I do want to make sure that we talk about pricing. It's one of my all-time favorite topics. So I want to ask you specifically about the research that you guys did that we mentioned earlier. And there was, when I was reading through it, and I started reading about pricing, and there was so many interesting things there. And the thing that stopped me on my tracks was this sentence, and I quote, "The fastest growing SaaS companies are those that experiment with their pricing." Talk about that. What does that mean, and how does that affect growth?
Pricing is one of the easiest levers for growth. If you imagine how hard it is to go and win another 10% new customers, so that means all of the demand gen, the op creation, the sales work, the enablement, the solutions work to go and win that extra 10% of customers, or just putting up your prices by 10%. One of those feels a lot easier than the other one to me. So pricing is one of your easiest levers for growth. And our data shows that companies that change their prices frequently, so they're testing and learning, and this isn't even kind of talking about which strategy they're adopting or what their price is, but if they change their prices frequently, they see a significant increase in average revenue per user over a few years than those who don't. So we've got a couple of, and I'll try and find the slide for the show notes. We've got a couple of data points on this of customers of ours, or people within our user base who haven't changed their price for 5 years. If we index on that as a flat ARPU, and then take people who change their prices once every year or once every quarter, we see the more frequently you change your prices, the more your ARPU grows. So there's that fundamental kind of truth that we see time and again in our data. And then it's to go on from that, it's not just about experimenting just with price, but with the metric of pricing. So if we take, the 2 obvious ones to start with, value or feature. So we pay for HubSpot because we use the marketing automation tool, or we pay for HubSpot based on how many leads it gives us. Let's take an obvious example there with a company we all know. So the value pricing, if you can use value metrics and multiple value metrics ideally, then generally your growth is higher, your expansion is higher, and your churn is lower than if you're using feature pricing. So it's the type of pricing. And then also it's thinking about, if we go back to the internationalization point, it's thinking about willingness to pay in different regions. It's thinking about currency. If you actually don't have packages that are suitable to people in other territories, they can't buy from you, and particularly in a self-serve world, that's really important. The friction of just $1 on your checkout when you're in lots of other territories is significant. And also, each of those territories has a different willingness to pay based on their GDP, economic climate, disposable income, the importance of this software versus local market competitors. And so you've got to dig into those things as well. And that's part of testing your pricing and learning.
See, I find this so interesting, this idea that changing your pricing so often. I mean, even if you do it yearly, for me, that's fairly frequently. And I'm wondering, do you have an explanation for the psychology behind that? Like, why does that change, or why does that affect the growth that much?
Great question, right?
I can't remember the author. It's one of those classic 80s business books, I'm sure, which is that that what you inspect, you can expect. But there is that kind of intuitive belief that if you are focusing on something and if you are measuring something, then you start to see results from it because you're looking at it, you're optimizing it, you're trying new ways of improving it. And so I think the first thing is that most people set their price when they launch their product and never even come back to it. So there's no focus on that being one of their growth levers. And therefore it can't be optimized. It's never optimized. In terms of it being, the amount of times you change your price being correlated with growth, I think of it much more intuitively, which is that if you are testing different forms of pricing metrics, pricing points, packages, then you're going to be learning. And it's the learning that correlates with growth more than necessarily the price changes. And so hopefully if you're changing your price every quarter, what you're doing is getting feedback from your customers and in your book of business and your revenue as to what things, what price points, what price metrics are correlating with better conversion, with more sticky customers, with customers that expand faster. And so it's the learning that I think you're baking in that's actually correlating or causing that growth.
So what do you think that, because it sounds like it's the easiest way to do it. How come so many organizations just don't do it? Why is it so scary? It's like, oh my God, they're going to churn if we're going to do this. What do you think?
I think it's hard to conceptualize. It's high friction because it has impact often on lots of different teams. It has impact on your existing customer base. So the communications are high friction. Are we going to charge customers differently? Is it for new business? What about people who are in deal cycle? What happens if we do this again very quickly? So I think there's a big amount of friction. And also it's interesting. It's not a muscle that has been built in many SaaS businesses if they are not mature, but we have a pricing consultancy called, it's a product-based consultancy called Price Intelligently that serves the who's who in the SaaS zoo with pricing strategy. And Price Intelligently, the team are absolutely superb. I love the time I spend with them. Super smart. And I think one thing that we're noticing in the market is some of our engagement shapes are changing a little bit because SaaS businesses are starting to have a pricing manager within their teams in a way that they haven't previously. And so it's a function that is now being recognized and resourced in a way that it just wasn't 5-6 years ago. And so I think that's one of the biggest issues too. No one has owned it as a thing within the business.
So if any SaaS marketer or leader listening to this are now inspired to start experimenting with their pricing, any advice for them how they should go about doing it or start doing it?
There's lots of good research on this. We've got much of it at priceintelligently.com and profitwall.com. OpenView, I think, also the VC fund, they've also got a lot of good information on pricing as well. Notion Capital have as well. And a place I go when I wanted to read about this first was to Pricing Page Teardown, which is actually a show that the ProfitWell team, part of our business, create. And they take one or two companies each episode, and they break down their pricing pages, tear down their pricing pages, look at the psychology, look at the economics, do some research with users of those products, and then come back with a philosophy and a strategy on how it can be improved. And so that's really light watching. I think there are like 7 series of that up at the moment, many episodes to dig through. So find a company that you know and you love, and just Google Pricing Page Teardown, and you'll find lots of episodes there to dig into as the first point of call.
Perfect. This is, I feel a bit divided by this topic, because on the one hand, I'm getting so excited about this dynamic pricing, but then at the same time, I know that there are still a lot of SaaS companies who don't even show their pricing on their website. Like, it's behind back doors, and you have to talk to a salesperson to even find out about it, and then it might not even be clear at that point. So I'm wondering. I think enterprise SaaS is a category of its own. I think I can see that you don't necessarily always want to or can put the pricing up on your website. But if we leave the enterprise companies aside for a minute, are there good reasons why SaaS companies shouldn't have pricing on their website?
More broadly, I think about this as a trend we're seeing where the buyer is taking hold of more of the sales process and is walking into the final stage of that sales process a lot more informed, and is less reliant on the sales rep or the active selling of the company, the vendor, the company that's providing the services or product. And so pricing is just one element of that, how you demonstrate value, whether you give a free trial. There are a whole bunch of other things that you might be doing there. It's interesting for me, in the self-serve world, there are an increasing number of businesses that aren't even asking for an email address before you try their product now, because they want to have zero friction in front of you experiencing the value that they're delivering. So when it comes to pricing, we've all been in that situation. We're poking around, trying to do a vendor kind of selection process between a few vendors, and there'll be a few vendors who just don't show pricing. Increasingly, I am seeing this personally, and in the people I talk to, and I know there's research out there in the wider market, that in several, in many markets, you will literally be removed from that vendor selection process if you don't show pricing, because you don't even meet the basic requirements of that researcher, that person in the team who's looking at it, to want to even move you to the next stage, because there is friction involved. Because in order to get pricing, I have to hand over 30 minutes of my time. I click on the button that says get started. And instead of getting started, I get routed to a Chili Piper form, and I get booked into a calendar of an SDR. And I have to listen for 30 minutes and answer lots of questions before I actually get any indication of what their pricing is whatsoever. And that's just not very buyer-centric. We're not actually serving the needs of that buyer. So I think there are lots and lots of good reasons why you should show pricing. There are lots of reasons why people feel hesitant about it. The competitive threat, whether there's a race to the bottom and people will go and undercut them. I think that, people feel insecure over whether they're leaving value on the table. Because if you don't show prices, when you get into that final stage scenario, you can optimize the price you're offering based on needing to close the deal, perhaps your cycle as a business, and also based on, whether you're going to deliver value, whether there's some risk involved on the customer side or your side. And based on their economic worth, if they're a customer that's got lots of money, lots of budget, you can, go in with a more full fat pricing option. So I totally understand that there are those, very well justified reasons why showing price in public is tough. I just think that there are reasons that the market is shifting beyond to a significant degree.
Right.
Excellent.
Before we go to the self-serve, I know
No,
that's the next topic, but
fine.
I actually do want to go back a little bit before we got into this pricing rabbit hole, because
You're already in it, darling.
when you talked about the levers for SaaS businesses success, and you mentioned acquisition, monetization, and expansion. In that answer, you talked a little bit about, and this is related to pricing a little bit. You talked about the different kind of ways to price your or like make different payment possibilities in different markets for your product. And I know that's something that you also talked about in the report, as I think you called it true localization. And I think that's also really interesting. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Like, because I do think that there's a tendency to, when you expand to a new market, using dollars is very easy. It's a fairly universal, money, but that might not actually always be the best way forward. So can you talk a little bit about how does it affect if you use different currencies, and then obviously also different payment options for that? What kind of impact can that have for growth?
Yeah, I should have loaded up the report before we came onto this.
Sorry.
I might forget some of the percentages, but it's pretty significant. So if we think about a few things here, firstly, let's just think about dollar. So, I'm going to say correlation rather than causation here, but where we look at our, 3,000 customers that are using Paddle, we see that if they go from a dollar to or whatever their core currency is to two currencies, then I think it's correlated with about a 12% increase in growth rate. And if they go to 25 different currencies, it correlates with a 24.5% growth rate. Increasing growth rate. And so again, it's pretty intuitive, right? That there's just going to be more friction with someone working out the price point of something in dollar with their home country and having to do that calculation in their head. And it probably, if they're in a country which doesn't have a stronger currency, probably the inbuilt assumption also that it's going to be more expensive because it's denominated in American dollars. Then there's payment acceptance methods, and we see the same kind of increasing growth when you offer different types of payment acceptance methods. So, if we start off and you've just got the ability to take a credit card, that might be fine. But then some people want to pay by Google Pay or Apple Pay, or they want to pay by PayPal. And different regions have very clear, propensities in those different payment methods. And so it's important to offer a range of payment methods as well as a range of currencies. There are other things as well. I can't remember the exact percentage, but we see significant friction when you don't bundle for B2B software, when you don't bundle tax. When you do bundle tax into the price, because you artificially inflate the price, because sales tax for most companies, they're not going to pay it because they're above the threshold and it's going to be remitted. And so that's something where if you're offering something to companies, to businesses, if you're baking in local sales tax, then it probably seems more expensive than that customer is used to paying for comparable services that don't bundle. So there's a whole bunch of localization implications you need to take care of there. I'll put the pitch in. I mean, that's what Paddle is built for, to take care of all of that for you with one click. But if you're not using something like Paddle, then there's a high degree of complexity when it comes to currency, when it comes to payment methods, when it comes to tax.
Thanks for going that over. I feel like I'm being free advertising for you guys for your research that you've been doing. But I did find it interesting, and I highly recommend people reading that.
I find it quite interesting as well, the localization of pricing. I never thought about it, that it's actually so it can have such an impact.
But there's also go for it, Andrew.
Well, and we didn't even touch now on willingness to pay. I think willingness to pay is super interesting when you start digging into what different customers across different regions are willing to pay for the same service. We've got a bunch of studies on that, and I won't quote any numbers here because I don't have them in front of me, but we can link to them in the show notes about how certain countries are completely willing to pay 15-20% more than your home territory, and others are unwilling to pay any more than 80% of perhaps your home territory. And so that's another way of maximizing economic value by changing the actual price in those different territories to align to their willingness to pay.
That's really interesting, because when I think about willingness to pay, I obviously, the way I've been used to it is, figuring out within one market, interviewing people and trying to find the right price point. But now that you said it, the difference between countries, that's something that I probably wouldn't have even thought about, that there can be that big of a difference between the willingness to pay between markets. That's fascinating.
All right. Now enough of this. Let's move on. So the pricing actually gives us a nice segue to the self-serve model. So what do you think, Andrew? What is the impact that self-serve model can actually have on growth? I'm sure you have lots to say about this.
So the vast majority of the businesses we serve are self-serve or have a hybrid motion. So they're doing self-serve as well as sales-led. I think it has significant implications for your business model, because you are likely to have a much larger top of funnel in terms of your acquisition. Lots of companies coming in, or people coming in and testing your products and services. Probably a lower conversion rate from those into paid than you would from a normal opportunity being created by a sales team. But we do see in our data that it correlates with lower customer acquisition cost overall and higher net promoter score. There's something about that ability to come in and test and build trust with a company, because you're able to actually see the value in front of you. So I'm a big fan. I think that there are a bunch of inconvenient truths around self-serve that we need to address. The first is that self-serve doesn't mean no sales reps. In fact, I think it's Adam Schonfeld who's done some really great research over this. Once you get past about 300 staff, SaaS businesses that look like they're product-led are probably hiring sales reps at a faster rate than sales-led businesses.
Oh, really?
So they've done the hard yards.
Why is that?
They've done the hard yards in the early stage of actually building this audience and building this perhaps freemium customer base, or building a self-serve customer base. And now they've got all these data points. People are moving from the MQL to the PQL, product qualified leads, where now salespeople can be much more efficient by jumping into communications with active accounts who are not paying or have been self-serve on low plans and can now be migrated up to team plans or enterprise plans. And so they find that that's working. And so they're hiring reps faster than perhaps a more linear process if you added a rep or two every quarter, if you're just doing that as your only motion. And so perhaps you have less in the beginning and then you catch up over time. So yes, interesting. Self-serve does not mean no sales reps. I think that's the first thing. And then I think it's really important to recognize that self-serve, again, is about reducing friction. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make sure there is nothing in the way of a buyer coming, trying, testing value, and actually experiencing that value. And the way I think about it is that, when you do outbound and ABM, the biggest problem is getting into the room of the buyer. And when you're doing self-serve, the biggest problem is building the systems and processes so you can be out of the room so they can see all of that themselves. So there are also big challenges there. Your product has to be good enough. You've got to be testing and iterating and releasing new product much faster. The demands of your customer are felt in terms of your usage data much stronger. It's very visceral. It's not just a bad reaction in a sales meeting. They'll just stop using the plan that they'd signed up for. It's much harder to get qualitative customer data. You see much more quant data, but actually it's harder to get that actual feedback and color. So I think there's a whole bunch of things that are hard about self-serve as well.
But do you actually see higher conversion rates then?
Absolutely. So once you get, if you see two types of opportunity, one that has many users who are already using a product and you can see that data, understand that data and speak with them, and you have an opportunity which is completely outbound, they maybe had a discovery call and nothing else, then yes, intuitively, I would imagine there is a much higher conversion rate. And there are businesses, Correlated is a good example of a business that has been built off the back of this, adding, feeding sales teams with product qualified accounts and product qualified leads for the purpose of seeing better conversion and a more efficient sales team. So yeah, it's interesting to see a whole category of marketing technology and sales technology being built on exactly that premise.
So if a company is wondering whether they should start moving towards a more self-serve model, are there any reasons or any kind of red flags or triggers that they should be kind of looking at to give them an indication that they might benefit from a self-serve model?
Yes, so I think companies that are likely to benefit from a self-serve model will have a strong product team that's releasing frequently and is able to respond to insight. They will have a reasonably fast time to value. Some products just take a whole while. They're very complicated to configure. They take a whole while before you actually see that value. And they're just not so appropriate for self-serve because someone's going to get bored or is going to get you tired before they get to that point of value realization. So I think, those would be two reasons not to choose self-serve. I think also if you're reliant on a small number of customers with a very high price point as part of your economic model, again, that's probably not so appropriate for a self-serve. But even if you don't become self-serve, I think the idea of reducing friction to your buyer and providing more value up front is a universal truth. So whether that is publishing research, whether that is an interactive demo, whether that is publishing your prices publicly, whether that is building a new feature that people can use free and then upgrade from that to the paid version by talking to your sales team. There are lots of things you can learn when it comes to audience and community. Community building and audience building is the companies who are product led, they tend to over-index in those because that's how they get their mass conversion into their product led base. And so I think there's a whole bunch of things there that you can learn from, even if you're still going to adopt a sales led approach.
Okay, so how about then if a company decides that, right, we need to move towards a more self-serve model, we think this might be good for us. What kind of steps should they take? What is the process that they should be aware of?
Mm-hmm. So, I think firstly it's walking through the onboarding process of a current customer and seeing where are the points of friction there that you need to productize or you need to put people against them. So, let's use a practical example. Paddle. We used to have a self-serve offering. We didn't for a while. We put up a new one. I think it was in March of this year. One of our biggest kind of points of friction in the self-serve onboarding is our risk processes, because we're taking a bunch of fundamental liability on behalf of our customers. We have to do KYB and KYC and other risk checks on them. And that can take a long time, particularly we weren't set up for the amount of demand we saw. And so there were long delays on people's risk checks as they were trying to onboard into our product. Wasn't a very good experience for people who were trying to onboard in that cohort. And so thinking through ahead of time, what are those points of friction within your onboarding? And then, as we've said, what are the points of the kind of the magic moments when they actually see value? And are they in the product early enough that someone is going to be able to come in, poke around, and then actually see some value and want to continue using or share the product? So those are two things to think about. The third one is just, do you have the data infrastructure to do this? It's just a different setup than managing, meetings into opportunities. If you're suddenly getting a much higher proportion of people who are engaging with your product or a portion of your product, and how you measure that, and how you identify the signal in the noise of people who are engaging deeply versus not engaging deeply, or how you map, emails to different accounts so that you understand when you've got a threshold volume of people from a certain account who are engaging with that product. The data infrastructure needs to be rethought too. So those are three things you should consider.
Okay, thank you so much for those answers, Andrew. And now it's our final segment, our Fast 5 segment. It's pretty simple. The name tells it all. 5 questions, 5 simple answers. Are you ready?
Go for it. Yep.
What book or books are you currently reading?
I'm reading a book by Louis Gerstner right now called Who Says Elephants Can't Dance, which is about IBM's turnaround.
Oh,
I love that title.
anything with animals.
A SaaS company you love and why?
Oh, I've got too many favorites on this one. Let's go for Gong.
Okay, why?
I love how, we've talked for years about the marketing sales divide and passing information and communication and metrics between the different vocabularies and functions of marketing and sales. And I love the fact that I can just dive into Gong, put in a few keywords and listen to sales calls, and listen to how people are reacting to our messaging, listen to how we're positioning our product through our field team. So yeah, it brings sales and marketing together.
What is your favorite place to read about growth?
I think I mentioned OpenView earlier. Kyle Poyer at OpenView, I think, is fantastic. I love his writing, so he'll be my go-to.
What is the most important growth metric in your opinion?
There isn't one.
I think that's the first time somebody has said that.
Honest feedback. Finally.
It depends.
Yeah, it depends. Yeah.
Okay, there's been a lot of advice, but one more. What is your best piece of advice for fellow SaaS marketers?
Read everything you possibly can, understand how everyone is doing it, but be really principled about making sure you discover and define your growth model, what's working for your business in your market for your product. It's probably going to take learnings from everyone else, but I just don't believe we can apply all of these frameworks and they have the same success in our circumstance. So just listen and learn to everything you can, but take some time to think about how it applies in your specific circumstance.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Andrew, for this and coming on our podcast. It was absolute pleasure.
Pleasure was all mine. Thank you so much, and have a fantastic rest of your day.
You too.
Perfect. Thank you. That's it. Thanks everyone for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. Let's keep the conversation going on Twitter at SaaS Growth Hub or LinkedIn at the SaaS Growth Hub Podcast.
And if you don't want to miss the next episode, make sure you subscribe to the Growth Hub on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or right here on YouTube.